We've been fighting a long time, and we have all lost so very much, so many loved ones gone. But you are not alone. There are pockets of resistance all around the planet. We are at the brink. You have no idea how important you are. If you're listening to this, you are the resistance.
Ave Maria Stella, Dei Mater Alma, atque semper Virgo, Felix Steli porta.
Summen siloda me, Gabrielis ore, fundados in pace, mutans nomen enes.
Back with Dr. Alan Fimister. Doctor, welcome back.
Hello. Thank you. Thank you.
So
for
we're
having me.
tackling the second, third, and fourth Lateran Councils, correct?
That's right. Yeah, somebody was asking me the other day about how important Vatican II is.
Never heard of it.
Objectively, how important it is, and so I got to thinking about this, and I was thinking, well, you know, councils, what do? They legislate for the whole church, and they define doctrines, and they define doctrines on two different levels. There's like stuff that they define as divinely revealed, so that if you deny it, you're a heretic, and then there's stuff that they infallibly define, but they don't say is divinely revealed. So that either means it is, but they didn't say it, or it means that it isn't, but you can still infallibly define it. So there's this thing called the primary object of the magisterium, which is stuff that Jesus or the Moses directly revealed, or the apostles, and then there's stuff which is that logically follows from that, but we're also including some truth of natural reason that's certain. So like you get a syllogism with one premise is from certain premise of natural reason, so not some kind of natural scientific thing, but 2 + 2 = 4,
Right.
or something, or something, and then something which is revealed, and you get a consequence of that, or you get something which is what's called a dogmatic fact, which is like the invalidity of Anglican orders, the legitimacy of an ecumenical council. Let's think, what's the other famous one? Oh, canonizations is a big dispute about whether canonizations are infallible or not, but I mean, it's the majority of sensible theologians, but only the majority of sensible theologians, there are sensible theologians who disagree as well, hold that canonizations are infallible. But anyway, these are dogmatic facts, right? And they can be infallibly defined, but you're not a heretic for denying them. So I thought, well, you can bracket councils by the top ones are the ones which define dogmas, define secondary object material, as it were, doctrines that aren't dogmas, and legislate for the whole church, right? That would be like they tick all the boxes. And then you get some which only define dogmas, or define stuff including dogmas, but don't do any disciplinary stuff. And then you get stuff that only does disciplinary stuff, and doesn't define any doctrines. And then Vatican II, I think, is the only one which defines stuff belonging to the secondary object of the magisterium, but doesn't define any dogmas and doesn't do any disciplinary stuff. So it's in a really strange position. It's the only one that's like that. So it said lots of things about what should be done in the church in regard to discipline after the council, but it didn't actually issue canons. So in that sense, it just like laid down guidelines, and then the Pope kind of ran with it and didn't necessarily always. Well, anyway, yes, we're going to
I repeated some things of the past, and all of a sudden, it somehow teachings came out of it.
Well, something like that. But Yeah, so I mean, what Vatican II does do is it issues loads of this stuff called authentic teaching, which is is what most papal encyclicals are. They're kind of like the Pope's not using his power of infallibility; he's just teaching, and so he enjoys this really strong presumption of reliability because it's the Pope who's teaching in an authoritative way, but he's not using his defining power, so it doesn't tick all the boxes for infallibility. So it gets called authentic papal magisterium, and the councils can do that as well, but it's rarer. But not in the case of Vatican II. There's absolutely vast reams of authentic teaching, but it's not definitive. But there are some things where I certainly would argue, and other theologians would argue, are definitive teaching, but they're not dogmas. And Paul VI specifically said that Vatican II didn't issue any dogmas. I mean, it did define some stuff that had already been defined, like it repeated papal infallibility. So I suppose those are technically dogmas, but it didn't do any new dogmas. All the other stuff that it defined was only doctrinal.
Already been done.
But it wasn't. But so there is, and it's not controversial stuff. I mean, the only thing that's definitive and is controversial is the thing on religious liberty. But we'll get into that when we get to Vatican II, which is a long way away. But the reason why I bring this up is because Lateran II and Lateran III only issue canons, right? There's no real doctrinal stuff in there. There's like implied teaching in the canons, but there's no dogmatic or defining canons. It's all canon law. So that might make them sound as if they're not very important, but that's probably slightly misleading to think that they're not very important. So I'd say they are down the bottom of the league in terms of the hierarchy of ecumenical councils, but they're still jolly important for their own reasons. Now, what you've got to understand is the period that we're looking at with Lateran II, III, and IV is now. What I said about them not being that important does not apply to Lateran IV. I should, in case anyone gets the wrong end of the stick, Lateran IV ticks all the boxes and is a mega council. So we'll get to that in a sec. But they're in a period known as the High Middle Ages. So there's this great historian I mentioned before, medieval historian called R.W. Southern, who defined the Middle Ages as the period during which the church was identified with the whole of organized society. And so it's like the integralist period in which there's this soul body union of the whole of Western society with the church. And that kind of reaches its highest intensity in the period that these councils occurred. And so I'd say that in a way, the legal basis for it is kind of is fundamentally set up by the coronation of Charlemagne. Mm-hmm. And the things that happened, earlier things like Justinian's law code and Theodosius's edict all the way back in the 4th century. But all the kind of apparatus is kind of the essential elements, the apparatus legally for this identification is set up by the coronation of Charlemagne. But then we've got that big gap that we talked about where everything goes chaotic in the West for ages. And then the Gregorian Reform movement kicks off, which we talked about last time. And the Gregorian Reform movement is what really, achieves in society this really intense identification. And in some ways, you could have said that before that, Byzantium was the Byzantine Empire, the surviving Roman Empire in the East. The identification was in some ways more intense there than it was in the West in some ways. But because things had gone so badly and it had been so difficult in the West because of the Germanic barbarian invasions, of course, it had been worse in the East in the sense that, a lot of people end up being ruled by Islam. But if you were the half of the East that didn't end up being ruled by Islam, then you were still just carrying on with the Roman Christian Empire. So for a long time in the East, this kind of identification was more intense. But because things were so bad in the West in terms of the barbarian rampage, and then the round 2 of the rampage with the Vikings and the collapse of Charlemagne's empire, the ecclesiastical hierarchy and the monks had been able to rebuild Western society from the ground up. And that becomes much, much more intense with the start of the Gregorian Reform movement in 1048. And so from that, so in a way, 1048 and or 1049, and the election. So it's 48 he's nominated, 49 he's formally elected. Saint Leo IX is the beginning of this really intense period of the High Middle Ages, and he and of course only just after that, just a few years after that, still actually just after Leo IX's death, in 1054, you have the sort of nominal moment of schism between Byzantium and the West, and that makes although the popes are obsessed, and the Middle Ages are partly defined by the fact that they're trying to reverse that, largely through the Crusades, which are an attempt to rescue the Byzantines and end the Great Schism. That's the original plan behind the Crusades. And many of the councils in the Middle Ages particularly in the later Middle Ages, are very fixed on trying to end the Great Schism, so that they're not okay with this schism, but because it leads to the effective temporary identification of the Church with the Roman Patriarchate, because there are so few in the East now in communion with Rome, that the popes have this much greater power over the remaining Catholic faithful, who are now the vast bulk of the Catholic faithful, because the Orthodox announced schism, but I mean they're the vast bulk of Christians, because the West is prospering and the population's increasing. So whereas Rome is definitely the most important, but one of the big Christian traditions in the first millennium, rapidly in the second millennium it becomes this huge behemoth of was much more much larger than the rest of that. So this identification becomes really intense, and the Gregorian Reform movement is really fixed on achieving that, right? They want to conform the whole of society to the gospel, and they've got very systematic ideas about how that's going to be done. They want to purify the church of all these abuses of clerical marriage and simony and lay investiture, and fighting like mad to try and achieve that. And which we talked about last time with Lateran I, but also they're very, very determined that the laity and the ordinary social life of the people should be conformed to the standards of the gospel, and many, many different intellectual movements are kind of feeding into this. So in the late 11th century, traditionally in Pisa, Justinian's law code, which he created back in the 6th century, is rediscovered. It had been sort of lost to the West, and it's a kind of it's a mixed blessing, the rediscovery of it. But it does because it's kind of a little bit more centralizing, and totalitarian is too strong. But it certainly gives more default authority to the civil power than is perhaps altogether healthy, and that's part of the logic of Justinian having codified the law when he did. It would take too long to go into that, but Bologna becomes the centre of legal scholarship, really spurred on by this rediscovery of this law code, and it heavily influences canon law, because the great sort of pioneers of the Gregorian Reform movement are also trying to really codify canon law. So you've got the civilian law of rediscovered from Justinian, and you've got canon law, which is sort of mined from the letters and of previous popes and the canons of previous councils, and it's being sorted out into much more of a system than it previously was in this period. And that's part of this drive to try and really, really, create truly Christian society, and at the same time, the universities are arising. Now, one of the things which has occurred in this period is that you've got the guilds, which are sort of regulatory bodies, professional associations. They're not quite trade unions. They're because they're more. I don't know what the equivalent institutions are in the United States, but we still have things a bit like them in Britain, some which really are them. I mean, like the way our legal profession works is very much still a medieval sort of idea. And universities are originally guilds. So universities, in fact, universities are guilds of scholars. and they're slowly emerging at this period. And Bologna is one of the oldest. So Salerno is a sort of medical center. Bologna becomes this big legal center, but Paris becomes the greatest of all of them, and Oxford's also very important. They're the kind of four first universities, and to massively oversimplify it, traditionally a fully formed medieval university has four faculties: the faculty of theology, which is the highest; faculty of arts, which deals with philosophy and human learning in general, actually, which is actually the fourth. And then the second one is the faculty of law, which deals with the organization of man as a rational animal. And then there's the faculty of medicine, which deals with the organization of man as an animal. So those are the four traditional medieval faculties, and still in very old universities like Oxford, because Paris was trashed in the French Revolution, so its traditions have kind of disappeared. But in Oxford they still have the four ancient faculties, and they have sort of ceremonial representatives, and they do stuff when big things with costumes happen and stuff like that. So I mean, it's all sort of still, it's still continuity of that existing. And also some of these older universities like Oxford and Cambridge, they still function much more like guilds. They're still very much controlled by the actual academics there, rather than being corporations that employ academics to hand out certificates to undergraduates, which is unfortunately how a lot of other institutions have gone. But but originally these universities, and so they become real powerhouses of learning, and you can see this massive acceleration in the Latin West just by looking at the buildings. Because if you look at Western architecture from like the earliest Greek stuff, right, and you do like a sort of time thingy motion sort of sequence of buildings over the centuries, right, you'll see there's this organic development, right. It really is. You can see the style slowly developing, all the way, through the early, the Greek temples, which are based on wooden models, which are now lost, and then you've got the Roman arch and the dome and all this kind of stuff, and there's this acceleration with the conversion to Christianity. The first, initially the Christians adopt the basilica form, which is a Roman law court, because they don't want to build their churches like temples, because what they're doing is fundamentally different from what the pagans are doing, who worship demons. They choose a different architectural style than the religious architecture of the pagans. So they use the legal architecture of the pagans instead, which also has the advantage that involves big halls in which the congregation can assemble, whereas the demon worshipping pagans would have been outside the temple, and it would have just been the priest in front of the statue of the false god in question.
Wow, that's not ecumenical now. Now, should we just say like non-godly creatures or
yes, yeah.
something? What's PC for that?
I think there's an ex-Dominican pagan called Matthew something, who was finally kicked out of the Dominican order. I've forgotten what his name is. But I think he had something called like the Center, probably still exists, the Center for Creation-Centered Spirituality or something, which sounds lovely, St. Francis, but actually it's all about worshipping the creature instead of the creator. But anyway, yes, not a good idea. But anyway, so it develops through that. But by the time it gets to Hagia Sophia, right, the Justinian builds, it's like a very dramatic, different style of architecture, very impressive.
Mm-hmm.
And you can see that that's like an intense moment in the development of Christian civilization, because there's so much exciting and new going on in the physical architecture. There's a civilizational self-confidence really expressed in stone. And in some ways, the one way to look at the 12th century is as they're trying to get back to where Justinian was. They're reconquering the lost Roman Empire. They're holding big ecumenical councils. They're trying to fix the mores of the people through the legal system. So in a way, it's and also even Boethius, who was in fact killed by the Ostrogoths because he was suspected of sympathy with Justinian's predecessor, but he was trying to put together the kind of perfect Christian philosophy. So he was very much trying to do what the universities were going to achieve in the High Middle Ages. So in a way, you can see the High Middle Ages as after centuries of kind of just about carrying on in the face of horrible barbarian invasions and Islamic conquest and all sorts of stuff. They're finally back on their feet, and they're trying to pick up from where they left off in the 6th century. That's one way of looking at it. But anyway, in the 11th century, this architectural development begins to accelerate. You have very impressive Romanesque or Norman architecture, which is you can see it's still kind of trying to ape ancient Roman architecture, but in a very clever and impressive way. It's no longer, because if you look at some of the architecture of Charlemagne's period, it's very much a kind of clumsy imitation of Byzantium. Whereas by the time you get to the late 11th century, it's a sophisticated engagement with the past. It's still very much growing out of it, but then by the time you get to the 12th century, you're entering the Gothic, and it's amazing. I mean, it's like, you know, centuries of development occurring in the space of a few decades, and these cathedrals, you know, you look at Notre Dame in Paris or Notre Dame in Chartres or any of these amazing Gothic cathedrals. These are not buildings built by people who are overawed by the pagan Roman past. You know, they you know, we know all that stuff, and we've assimilated it, and we've taken it all up, but we've moved on, and boy, have we moved on.
Now we're at the 7-Eleven churches.
Say again, sorry?
Now we're up to 7-Eleven churches.
But I mean, they look like, you know, if you'd seen a building like that, it back in Justinian's time, or in still less 200 years earlier, still more rather 200 years earlier, it would have looked like an alien spacecraft had just landed in the middle of your city. I mean, the Gothic buildings are really, really dramatic development and swaggering self-confidence, and you can see what a sort of cultural cringe the so-called Renaissance is later on, because suddenly it's kind of like, suddenly they're desperately trying to imitate the Latin that was written in the 1st century BC and AD, and all the buildings now have to be pastiche Roman pagan buildings. And there's this great Catholic convert, sort of guru of neo-Gothic architecture, Augustus Welby Pugin, and he wrote these wonderful books. They're great fun. They're really aggressive, and he hates classical architecture. Well, he doesn't hate the original classical architecture. He thinks that's fine. He sees that in the same way that medieval philosophers do, as like Aristotle. You know, we need all that, we know all that, but we also have revelation, and we're perfectly capable of advancing it. And so they take it up and they move on. You know, so in the same way, Pugin thinks of classical architecture as good for its time, but basically pagan, and we have revelation, we've moved on. Of course, he doesn't call it Gothic architecture, because that's actually an insult vented by the neo-pagans in the Renaissance. They were trying to associate it with barbarism instead of nice pagan classical antiquity. So he just calls it Christian architecture as opposed to pagan architecture. But anyway, so there's none of this, you know, cultural cringe Renaissance type stuff going on in the High Middle Ages. There's swaggering, self-confident Christianity, and in fact, the month before Urban II calls the First Crusade, which I put the Council of Clermont in the wrong year last time. I put it a year later. It should have been 1095. I said 1096. Which
Login will start later.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, so it was in, I think if I remember right, it was October 1095, the month before the Council of Clermont, where he called the First Crusade. Urban II, who was a monk of Cluny, went back to Cluny, and he consecrated the new building of the Abbey of Cluny, and it was huge, and it was bigger than the Hagia Sophia. So it was the first time since Justinian's time that there was a building in the West that was bigger than a building in Byzantium, and so it was like an epoch, you know, defining moment, you know. You know, there's a strong connection between the fact that it's Cluny, the Abbey of Cluny, which is like the seed of this great reform movement, and it's their abbey, which is bigger than the Hagia Sophia. And the next month, one of their guys, who's the Pope, sends his Western bother boys to sort out Islam for the Byzantines. So this is really, the Latins are back, and they're heavily armed, and they've got big buildings.
Where's the movie voice guy for that one?
sorry.
Back from the West.
So the reason why, so we may look back at Lateran 2 and Lateran 3 and we think, so yeah, so the Latins are back with their universities and their big buildings, and they're heavily armed, and they're off to save the Byzantines, and so we look at some Lateran 2 and 3 and we think, oh well, these are just, you know, disciplinary things, and why have an ecumenical council for this stuff? But what it really reflects is the fact that they're so, from their perspective, they're so close, and the great reproach, implicit reproach of paganism against Christianity is the fall of the Roman Empire, right? You know, just, you know, less than 20 years after the Emperor Theodosius extinguished the Vestal flame and ended paganism, the Rome falls to the Goths, right? So the great implicit reproach is, you know, we ruled the known world and then you lot messed it up, you know. So the fact that the Latins in 1099 turn up and retake Jerusalem, is this kind of this moment that, you know, they're back. So this is why they're going to get back the Roman Empire as it was at the death of Trajan. They're going to build bigger buildings than the Romans. Their philosophy is going to surpass the Romans, and they're going to conform society to the true religion, right? So it's really, really important. So in a way, if you take one way of, so in a way, the High Middle Ages kind of begins with Leo IX's election in 1049, but that's really the kind of preamble. And then with 1099, bang, Jerusalem is captured, the greatest event since the resurrection, etc., as they said at the time. And so that's like the real high point. And then it kind of stretches on to 1274, which the Second Council of Lyon occurred, which we'll look at some later point. And it was also when Thomas Aquinas died. And there's a very discernible decline in the last quarter of the 13th century. You know, the popes start to be, you know, leave something to be desired, and you know, dodgy deals with secular rulers, and by the end of the century things are going really quite badly. And, you know, shortly after the end of the century, the popes are basically hostages in France for 70 years. So I mean, it's not good. So you can see there's a very visible decline from 1274 onwards. So if you actually take 1099 as the beginning of the high point and 1274 as the end, what you get bang in the middle, in fact, is 1187, the Battle of Hattin, which is what causes the loss of Jerusalem to the Crusaders. So the first half of that kind of apogee is the sort of the heroic age when the Latins are in possession of Jerusalem, and they're really fighting to, the universities are being established, canon law is being crafted, Aristotle is being translated into Latin. Boethius was trying to do that, but he got killed by the Goths, so he never managed to do it. So that really is a very visceral sense of resuming where we left off in the 6th century. There, that they resume the program of translation that Boethius was working on when he died. So it's in that context of this that you have these two councils. So the first of them is Lateran II. Now, Lateran II is called by Pope Innocent II for slightly sort of banal reasons, which is that that when he was elected Pope on the death of Honorius II, there was a disputed papal election, and an anti-pope was elected along with Innocent II, and it was rather complicated, and it went on for some time, and then the anti-pope died, and Innocent II was finally recognized as the unchallenged pope. And in order to sort of put a seal on his status as the unchallenged pope, he summoned this ecumenical council. And these councils had very large numbers of bishops, because the West was very large and highly populated, and there were lots and lots of bishops. People were doing what the Pope said. The Investiture Controversy had been resolved with the First Lateran Council, so the papal leadership of Christendom was very vivid. But one of the and if you look through the canons, they're very much just reassertions of the ideals and priorities of the Gregorian Reform movement. There's a couple of obscure social heresies which are condemned there. things to do with rejecting clerical authority and things like that. And this is going to become a bigger and bigger problem, because one of the side effects of this intensification of the attempt to perfectly identify the church with organized society is that the clergy are just not that impressive, and so the laity are getting more and more sort of higher and higher expectations, and the clergy are just not delivering on those expectations. And the universities are partly an attempt to provide a more educated clergy. The seminary as an institution doesn't come into existence until the Counter-Reformation. So really, you become a cleric before this period through a kind of just apprenticeship to the existing clergy. Even going back to Charlemagne's time, there's been a big push to get cathedral schools set up, and this is which has been interrupted somewhat by the problems of the falling apart of Charlemagne's empire, and that's resumed particularly noticeably in Lateran III. So but these social heresies which start to arise, some of them are like well-intentioned people who are just sort of upset that they're not meeting up with the ideal, but then get sort of confused. And one of the big errors that tends to float around among unhappy laity is the idea that a priest can't validly confect the sacraments unless he is in a state of grace. Now, obviously, that would completely destroy the visibility of the church, but it's very easy to understand why the laity can get very upset, if they know that the priest is basically almost illiterate and is living a scandalous life and has some shacked up with some woman or whatever, or several women. And obviously, they don't, it's very understandable that they would want to deny that he was the real deal, but it's unfortunately fatal for the existence of the church as an error. So this is one of the problems that starts to arise. One of the other problems that is tied in very much with Lateran III is the struggle, the continued struggle with the empire, because and really I think in some ways the degree of papal leadership that is attempted in this period is absolutely key to the great achievements of the 12th and 13th century, but it's probably a mistake. It's kind of one of these it's like one of these tragic flaws, that brings about the downfall of the great, in this case, era rather than man, and yet is somehow bound up with his greatness, because the popes just can't be the emperors of Christendom, right? It would undermine the very nature of the church if the popes were actually wielding temporal power and actually, ruling directly the whole of Christendom, as if they were the emperors and the kings were the proconsuls or whatever.
Is that your two swords chapter?
Well, yes, exactly. That's the thing. So this clarification of the relationship between the temporal and the spiritual really arises at this time. And one of the great figures of this period is St. Bernard. He isn't actually the founder of the Cistercians. The Cistercians are founded just a year before the First Crusade takes Jerusalem. And they're founded by these three saints, Stephen Harding, Robert of Malem, and Alberic, the three great Cistercian founders. And what they are is a more ascetic, more plain and simple application. So St. Bernard is the second generation of the Cistercians, but he becomes such a rock star that everybody kind of identifies it with him, even though he's not actually the founder of the Cistercians. But he recruits vast numbers of people, like his entire extended family and vast numbers of monasteries. And but he's also very important in developing this precision on the doctrine of the two swords and precisely the relationship between the spiritual and temporal power. But it's clear that whatever the technicalities of it are, which are all, definitely above criticism, because that doctrine of St. Bernard's is solemnly defined in 1302 by St. Boniface, or not St. Pope Boniface VIII. Hopefully he's a saint.
We just had a canonization, ladies and gentlemen.
And Dante doesn't put him in hell, does he? But anyway, yes. Yes, perhaps he does put. I can't remember. Paul Boniface. Anyway, but he had a difficult time with it. Yeah, he yes, defined. But it's clear that popes are really leading Christendom, and we talked about last time how the First Crusade, there were no kings or emperors on it, so it's very much the papal army which takes Jerusalem. And now the kings and emperors try and remedy this in the 12th century. They're trying to sort of wrench back the leadership of Christendom. The Second Crusade, which happens after Edessa falls back to the Muslims. So there are 4 Crusader states, as they're called, established at the end of the First Crusade, basically because of the fact that the Byzantine Emperor abandoned them at Antioch. So instead of just becoming provinces of the Byzantine Empire ruled by the Latins, they become independent states. And the first of them to be established is the county of Edessa. And then the other 3 are the Principality of Antioch, the County of Tripoli, and the Kingdom of Jerusalem. And but the first one that was established is the County of Edessa, and that gets lost again to the Muslims in 1144, and that causes kind of panic, because rightly so, because it really is a sign that things are not safe in the reconquered Holy Land. And so the Second Crusade gets sent out after that, and there's lots of kings on the Second Crusade, but it doesn't achieve very much. St. Bernard is a big campaigner and recruiter for the Second Crusade, and he's very miserable when it turns out that very little is achieved by it. In fact the King of Germany, the Holy Roman Emperor elect, goes on the Second Crusade, and between the Second Lateran Council and the Third Lateran Council, so the Third Lateran Council is in 1179. Between the two is the great big reign of the Holy Roman Emperor Frederick I, Frederick Barbarossa, and he's a very sort of towering figure. I think physically he was a towering figure, and he's a sort of great warrior and general. And he reigns as emperor from 1155 to 1190, so it's a very long reign, and he's very keen to restore imperial leadership of Christendom and imperial leadership in the Crusades eventually, and he and one of the things he wants to do is to gain real imperial control over northern Italy, because northern Italy, as I think we talked about before, is only really nominally under the authority of the emperor. They're basically all the local little towns become autonomous little republics, with they get concessions and charters and whatever from the emperor, but really they're basically sovereign, more or less, not legally but de facto. And Barbarossa wants to, this is his nickname, means Redbeard, and he wants to make Northern Italy actually be his and just a province of his empire, and in order to really assert his authentic majesty as Roman emperor. And of course he's being spurred onto this by the study of Roman law, of Justinian's Roman law, because the emperors in the West are thinking, well, this is what we're supposed to be doing, this is who we are. So they're getting much stronger sense of the autonomy and the absolute power of the emperors. And this leads to a very, very long war with lots of anti-popes. The popes are determined to prevent the emperors dominating northern Italy in this way, because they think they're just going to end up as the chaplains to the German emperors if they allow this to happen. And so there's real bitterness and real vicious struggle, particularly with Pope Alexander III, who is also Pope for an extremely long time, 1159 to 1181. So their reigns overlap, and he's organizes the Italian city-states into this Lombard League in order to resist Frederick I's attempts to conquer things. And in the end, the popes win. Now, this is it's resolved in 1177. It's called the Peace of Venice, in which an amicable reconciliation is achieved between the Pope and the Emperor. Although it's interesting that in the middle of this struggle, Manuel the First, rather, Komnenos, who's the emperor in Constantinople. He actually campaigns a little bit in Italy. He doesn't get very far, but he's the last Byzantine emperor to campaign in Italy, and he, given that the Pope's relations with Frederick Barbarossa was so bad, he actually suggests, we could see about undoing that business in 800, or rather correcting it. I could come up to Rome and you could crown me emperor instead of this Barbarossa chap. So, and that would, of course, have perhaps untied the difficulty that was created there, and been a real way of reconciling East and West. I mean, it's fanciful. The power of the Byzantine Emperor is too weak. It would have just provoked the Western emperors and achieved little. So, which is why the offer doesn't really get taken up. But I mean, there really is progress there, and and in Manuel I's time, because the Crusader states are more threatened, and because the Second Crusade doesn't really successfully undo the destabilization of them that have been caused by the loss of Edessa, the Crusader states start to get all chummy with the Byzantine Emperor again. So the situation that Urban II had wanted to happen, of the Crusades becoming a vehicle for the reconciliation of the Byzantine Emperor and the West, looks as if it might happen, and there's a real cultural exchange going on there which has not happened previously, because the Byzantines have been so contemptuous of the Latins. But Manuel is quite keen on Latin culture, and he even holds tournaments and jousting and stuff in Constantinople. And I always think it's interesting. There's a romance by one of the other huge cultural changes in this period is the invention of romantic love, which is basically a Christian idea. But it partly comes. A lot of modern scholars think that it comes out of the universities trying to pin down how many sacraments there are. So this is one of the really interesting examples of doctrinal development, because all those churches with valid apostolic succession of their bishops all agree that there's 7 sacraments, right? But none of them said there were until the 12th century. The Latins suddenly were like, they've got their universities together, and they've got their Aristotelian logic translated, and they're trying to sort stuff out, all the messy stuff. They're trying to sort it in the way that Boethius was already trying to do back in the 6th century. They resume this task, and they're like, there's those kind of stuff that we do, and even if the priest isn't worthy, it still happens. And what do you call that? How many of those are there? And they're like, those are the sacraments, and I think there's 7 of them, and so they start to divide up, and what do you have to do to be sure that really happens? Well, the stuff you have to do, and the stuff you have to say, and the stuff you have to intend, and they kind of work out, and so they're finally getting down to all the technicalities of this, and one of the big shockers that this produces is a problem with marriage. Because they're like, well, so what is marriage? And they're like, what's the form, and what's the matter, and what's the intention? And they realize that basically it's the agreement to a perpetual monogamous union for the sake of procreation between the 2 parties is what marriage is, and that's the essence of it. And so the consent is what creates the marriage. And so they'd always kind of assumed, no one had ever said it, they always assumed that it was basically to do with offering her dad a few cows, and getting a corner of that field was in exchange was what marriage was all about. But when they really thought about it, they realized that it was the exchange of consent. And so actually wanting to marry the guy or wanting to marry the girl was really turned out to be quite important. And this seems to have transformed Western culture. This whole concept of romantic love starts to bubble up, and one of the big effects of that are these romances about heroes. You compare, for example, the Song of Roland, which was probably written around the time, or perhaps a bit before, or just simultaneous with, or something like that, the First Crusade. The Song of Roland, which is about one of Charlemagne's campaigns, heavily embellished, is very kind of action movie. There's not a lot of girls in it, really. It has to be said. It's mostly about smiting Muslims and, you know, blokey camaraderie on the battlefield. And there is one female in it who dies of grief when she finds out that Roland's died, but she has a walk-on part. Roland's dead. Boom. That's it. Yeah, there's really not a lot else going on. But then, just a few decades later, you compare that to the romances of Chrétien de Troyes, who writes these Arthurian stories. And it's all, you know, there's lots of adventures and stuff, but there's lots of mushy-gushy sort of romantic stuff going on there as well. And so there's been a big transformation in Western culture, just like with the architecture in this very short period. But he wrote one of these romances called Clige, and the hero of that is the son of the emperor in Constantinople. And so there being, you can see that along with Manuel's jousts and the deals which he strikes with the Crusader states to be recognized as their feudal superior, and he marries a Latin princess. And so really what Urban II wanted to happen is kind of happening at this point. But then it all and of course, in a way, Manuel, sorry, I keep saying Manuel II, he's much later, Manuel I, his suggestion that he might be crowned emperor by the Pope is also a sign, you know, of the potential reintegration of East and West. But it doesn't happen for a couple of reasons. One is that temporarily the conflict in the West is resolved for three reasons. One is the Byzantine emperor isn't that powerful. So he's not really going to become a major power on the Italian mainland enough for it to be worth the Pope's while to alienate other people in the West by going back to being chummy with the Byzantines. The second reason is that the conflict with the Western emperors is finally resolved by the Peace of Venice in 1177, but probably the single most catastrophic reason, prior at least to the debacle of the Fourth Crusade, which we'll get to in a sec, is what's called the Massacre of the Latins in 1182. So unfortunately, Manuel II dies in 1180, and his son is deposed by his evil uncle, Andronicus I. Now, Andronicus I is an absolute scumbag. I mean, he is one of the nastiest figures in Western history.
With a name like that, you have to be.
Well, yeah, I assume Shakespeare got the idea of Titus Andronicus from, I mean, it's very garbled where that play, what period in history that play is supposed to be set in, but I think somewhere in the background, at least subconsciously, Andronicus I must be the inspiration for the name of Titus Andronicus anyway. But he's really, really foul, horrible person, and you know, he murders his nephew, and he steals his very, very, very young fiancée and does her and basically marries her, and yes, profoundly inappropriate. But one of the things he does and he overthrows the rightful emperor's mother, who is this Latin princess, but one of the things he does in order to kind of get to power is that he rides a wave of reaction in Byzantium against this reconciliation with the West and appreciation of Western culture. Is still very difficult emotionally for the Byzantines, because their instinct is very much still to look down on the Westerners as you know, semi-literate, revolting barbarians. And so basically in 1182, he leads this massive, you know, they just grab all the Latins in the Byzantine Empire out of their beds in the middle of the night and murder them all. And so that's this absolutely poisons the relations and ruins the chances of a proper reconciliation and everything that Urban II had been working for. And only 5 years after that, in 1187, you have the Battle of Hattin, in which the true relic of the True Cross is captured by the Muslims. I mean, obviously we have chunks of it, but the largest single part of the relic of the True Cross was captured by the Muslims at the Battle of Hattin and is never recaptured, and nobody knows what happened to it. And just shortly afterwards, Jerusalem falls back to Islam. So it's called, and the Pope Urban III dies of shock when he finds out about this. So I mean, it's a real, you know, it's a real wound in the tale, the hitherto tale of triumph of the High Middle Ages. But anyway, Lateran 3 occurs just before, the year before the Massacre of the Latins in 1179. It's rather like Lateran 1 was called to confirm the restoration of peace after the Investiture Controversy. So Lateran 3 is called to confirm the restoration of peace after the Peace of Venice. And it's presided over by this great Pope Alexander III. And again, it's largely disciplinary canons, but they're very interesting. For example, great contemporary relevance is Canon 11, which decrees the deposition and excommunication of priests who have engaged in sodomy. It's the first piece of legislation on that subject. Although Peter Damian was very vociferous about this question back in the previous century, and of course that's always been one of the problems with the enforcement of clerical continence, is that once you're enforcing clerical continence, you have to be much more vigilant that people who weren't that interested in girls anyway don't decide that the clergy now becomes a helpful career move. So as has been manifested more recently, Canon 25 has very strict penalties for anyone who engages in usury. There are actually lots of ecumenical councils which legislate against usury. You know, a lot of the kind of sort of a lot of those forces in the church nowadays who are more conservative, but whose principal interest is in turning the church into sort of chaplaincy to Western capitalism, as opposed to, you know, the spiritual power that transforms the world into a fit dwelling place for the Christian.
I wasn't going to say it. You said it. I wasn't going to say it. I heard the U word, and I heard the U word. I'm going, uh-oh.
Well, so these kind of conservative figures very much don't like the church's teaching on usury and try to imply that it's really not that important. But the Ecumenical Council seem to think that it is quite important, and eventually, thankfully, the Council of Vienne, which we'll get to in a while, is actually defines that to deny that usury is a mortal sin is a heresy. This is a disciplinary canon, but it's very clear that there is a disciplinary canon about usury at the Council of Nicaea, in fact, but it's principally trying to stop the clergy engaging in usury because they don't have the power to be in Nicaea. You know, the Roman Empire's only just stopped persecuting Christianity, so they don't have the power to suddenly say, "Oh, you all stop lending money at interest," right? They can't do that because they're not in the saddle in those terms, whereas they very much are at this point. So this canon applies to everybody that is issued by Lateran 3. Canon 19 bans the taxation of the clergy without the consent of the spiritual power, and that's people often don't understand that. It just sounds like kind of horrendous clericalism, but I mean, of course, in fact, you know. Most countries, certainly in Britain and the United States, churches are more or less tax exempt anyway. But the logic behind that is that there are two, as it were, using later terminology, sovereign powers that govern Christian society, and so in a certain sense, the clergy are a bit like, you know, being ordained to the major orders or even minor orders at this point is a bit like getting diplomatic plates on your car. You know, you're not really subject to the temporal power now. You're subject to the spiritual power, and so you get this thing called benefit of clergy, that if you're a cleric, you get tried by the clerical courts, and that is handy because the clerical courts don't use capital punishment. Although for the very worst offences, they just degrade you from the clerical state and then hand you over to the temporal courts to execute you. But it's important because it's important. I mean, obviously it's open to abuse. All forms of power are open to abuse, but you know, less open to abuse when there are very, very powerful Christian rulers, I would suggest. And it is very important that the spiritual power be seen as fully sovereign and not just a non-governmental organization within the framework of the state, which is also a later construction. And Canon 18 of Lateran III is very much about cathedral schools, which we were talking about as being the sort of what triggered, in many cases, the creation of the universities. But so for example, the Cathedral School of Paris was the core of the University of Paris, which was the greatest medieval university. And but lots of other scholars turned up. Other religious houses would have schools, and other scholars who were just famous would turn up, and people would come and sit at their feet and pay them to attend their classes, and so you ended up with these little federations of colleges or halls, and again, the structure of Oxford and Cambridge is still very much like that because of the fact that they, albeit with a great deal of vandalism done in the Reformation, nevertheless the same institution have survived across that period, and therefore they still have very much the medieval structure. So that is Lateran III. Now, if we have time, then we should probably look at Lateran IV. I don't know how long we've gone on. Do you want to look at Lateran IV now, or should we look at it next
We're at
time?
an hour. What do you think?
Well, I think we could probably do Lateran IV in 10 minutes or 20 minutes, if that's okay.
Go for it.
Okay. So Lateran IV is the kind of in some ways people see it as the crowning moment of the Middle Ages, right? Because Frederick Barbarossa, the emperor who had the big feud with Alexander III, he goes off on the Third Crusade after the Battle of Hattin to try and restore Jerusalem. And he has a huge army, and he's very powerful, and we probably would have got Jerusalem back actually in the Third Crusade if he'd made it to the Holy Land. But he's getting on a bit by this point, but he's still a scary old warrior. And but he stops off in Anatolia or something, I think it is, to take a drink of water out of a stream, and he falls in, probably in full armor, and that's it. He drowns. That's the end of him. So I remember when I was an undergraduate, my tutor set us an essay title, what were the main problems faced by Frederick Barbarossa and how well did he deal with them? And one of my colleagues, who was a Scotsman who knew how to enjoy himself, he had not got around to writing this essay by the time it was due in, and so he just wrote on the top of a piece of paper, he couldn't swim. Which is probably unfair on poor old Frederick. It's probably just that he was wearing heavy armor or something.
300 pounds of armor.
But the fact that he died in such weird circumstances is partly led to this legend in Germany that he's sleeping under some mountain somewhere and he's going to come back and do whatever he's going to do, and which is probably why Hitler called the invasion of Russia Operation Barbarossa, but because they were obsessed with these kind of weird legends, the Nazis. But anyway, so he never had that big a role, or he didn't, because he never got there in the Third Crusade. In the end, it would be the King of England, Richard the Lionheart, who was the biggest figure in the Third Crusade and achieved a great deal, but realized in the end that he couldn't retake Jerusalem because he didn't have enough troops to garrison all the port cities that he'd recaptured in order to keep the Kingdom of Jerusalem on its feet. If he would then take Jerusalem, he'd have to move all those troops to Jerusalem. Then the Muslims would take back the port cities, and Jerusalem would immediately be recaptured. So he kind of went home in order to try and get a new army and come back and get Jerusalem. And then in the meantime, he got shot by some completely random bloke with a crossbow, and so it never happened. But so Frederick Barbarossa's reign comes to this surprising end, but he is succeeded by his son Henry VI, who is a fully competent adult, and so it looks like the empire is still going to be immensely powerful, and then this Emperor Henry VI manages to marry the heiress to the Kingdom of Sicily. And this is a complete nightmare from the Pope's point of view, because they're desperate that the emperors should not control northern Italy. And the thing they were most terrified of is that the emperors should control northern Italy and Sicily, because the Kingdom of Sicily also includes the bottom of the boot of Italy. So that would mean they were completely surrounded in the middle between imperial territories. So it looks like this is going to be the moment at which the empire really takes back control of Christendom over the papacy. And it never happens because Henry VI dies unexpectedly young. So his son, who's only a baby, who becomes the Emperor Frederick II much later, and is a big problem, he becomes the heir to these two lines, the Sicilian line and the Hohenstaufen line of emperors in Germany. But that problem is temporarily bracketed because he's too small a kid. And in fact, there ends up being a long dispute between two rival dynasties, the Welfs and the Hohenstaufen, over whether, because obviously rival dynasties are kind of interested in trying to use this opportunity to get hold of the imperial title in Germany, and the popes aren't that worried about them doing that because they quite like the. But unfortunately, the Pope is left as kind of guardian of the young King of Sicily, so he's kind of got to be an honest broker and not just sort of, you know, chuck him in the canal. But the popes would really quite like to see two different dynasties, and so this leads to a certain degree of instability, particularly in the empire, but in the empire meaning the German kingdom, but the result of that is it leaves this gap, rather like what happened between the death of the Emperor Henry III and the minority of the Emperor Henry IV back in the 11th century. It leaves this gap during which the popes can take centre stage, and the popes are rarely averse to taking centre stage when the opportunity presents itself. So, between the death of Pope Alexander III and 1198, the Pope has been there've been various popes. They've all been pupils, pals, companions, comrades of Alexander III. So very much in the stable of this kind of, you know, heroic Pope defending papal rights and papal leadership of Christendom against Frederick Barbarossa. And this climaxes with the election of Pope Innocent III in 1198. And Innocent III's pontificate is basically seen as the high point of the papacy in the Middle Ages. And it climaxes just before his death with the Fourth Lateran Council. And Innocent III really does preside over Christendom. And, you know, he excommunicates kings and emperors, and they do as they're told, and they conform. And he excommunicates, he puts the whole of England under an interdict for several years because King John, who's terrible successor of Richard the Lionheart, he doesn't want to accept Pope Innocent. There's a dispute over the election to the Archbishop of Canterbury, and Pope Innocent III, in the end, rather than picking one side or the other, drops in a friend of his, Stephen Langton, to be the Archbishop of Canterbury. Stephen Langton's a pretty amazing figure. He wrote Magna Carta, which is the origin of the Anglo-Saxon tradition of limited government and constitutional monarchy, and he introduced the elevation of the host and the chalice at Mass, because when he was an academic at the University of Paris, there was a group of dodgy academics who denied that the transubstantiation occurs at the moment of the words of institution. So in order to annoy them, he introduced this idea of elevating the host and the chalice immediately after the words of institution was said, so that people could adore our Lord in the Blessed Sacrament immediately that he was present there, just to really annoy the people who had this unorthodox view about when transubstantiation occurs. He also put the chapters into the Bible, and he wrote the Golden Sequence, the Veni Sancte Spiritus. So, you know, he's a bit of a rock star, Stephen Langton. There was a later English bishop. He's never had as far as I know, there's never been a cause for his beatification or canonization. But there was a later English bishop who had a vision. I think it was 3 years after Langton's death, which also happened to be 30 years after Richard the Lionheart's death. And there was an English bishop who had a vision of the two of them being released from purgatory. So Richard the Lionheart had spent 33 years in purgatory, and Langton 3 years in purgatory. So if that vision's reliable, they're both in heaven up there praying for us. It's just, you know, they didn't quite make the grade in terms of canonizable saints. But he had problems with the King of France as well, dodgy marital goings on, but Innocent III's bang, smashing him down, telling him what to do. But the thing the popes were really obsessed with above all is, and also Innocent III is one of the popes who gives the grandest declarations concerning the nature of the papal office. So there's 3 famous quotes from him on this. His coronation sermon he quotes Jeremiah, "I've been set this day over the kingdoms and over the nations, to uproot and to tear down, to lay waste and to destroy, to build and to plant," right? So he's like, blue lightning coming out of his fingertips. And he, I've forgotten which one. There's one of these statements is in a letter to the Patriarch of Constantinople. He says, and I've forgotten where the third one is, but he famously says that the Pope is below God but above man, and given not only the universal church but the whole world to govern. And then the other one is, just as the moon derives its light from the sun, so too the royal power derives the splendor of its dignity from the pontifical authority. Right? So this is kind of full on, you know, this is Pope on steroids, huge crown, massive cope, enormous pallium. So he, now one of the problems is, one of the other big problems, well, there's two problems. So obviously they lost Jerusalem. He's very, very keen to get Jerusalem back. That's a key part of how the popes managed to get themselves into this position, was through the capture of Jerusalem in the First Crusade. And so the Fourth Crusade is launched early on in, 5 years into Innocent III's pontificate. And this is a complete disaster because the leaders of the Fourth Crusade do a deal with the Venetians to build an absolutely massive fleet. Now, the Venetians are very efficient and clever and always interested in making a lot of money out of things and are not to be trusted. And the Venetians agree to build them a massive fleet so they can just sail to the Holy Land and capture Jerusalem. And it's been realized by Richard the Lionheart and other crusaders prior to the Fourth Crusade that the key thing is because they don't have the backup from Byzantium. You know, it was going that way with Manuel I. It's all messed up with Andronicus I. It's probably never going to be properly fixed. After Andronicus I eventually gets deposed and is hacked to death over 2 days in the middle of the Hippodrome. So he has a thoroughly deserved fate. I think they tie him between two pillars and then slowly hack him to bits. So it's pretty horrendous. But he was a very
go all out.
So they, having kind of given up on the Byzantines to some extent, they decide that what they need to do is conquer Egypt, because Egypt is like a stable territory that could be controlled from the west, has its own resources. I mean, to this day, half the population in North Africa lives on the banks of the Nile. So Egypt's very important. They think, well, if we could take Egypt, then we can maintain the Holy Land, which is much less defensible. The Holy Land is a very difficult area to defend, just ask the Israelis. You've got to be on top of your game. So they think, well, if we get Egypt, we can then take the Holy Land, and then we'll be able to resupply Egypt without having to worry about the Byzantines and whether we can trust them. And then we can leave it to the Spanish to get the way to the bottom of the Iberian Peninsula and get Morocco and Tunisia and Algeria, and then everything will be happy again, and we'll be back to the Roman Empire at the death of Trajan, which is always the ultimate objective. And so they decide, well, we'll get a massive fleet, we'll go and capture Egypt, and then we'll sail off to Jerusalem, recapture Jerusalem, and it'll be amazing. And the Venetians are like, great, yeah, we'll build you a huge fleet, you know, sign here. So they agree, and they build this massive fleet. I think Venice kind of stops doing anything else for a year or something crazy and just builds massive numbers of ships, excuse me. Then, unfortunately, not everybody got the memo. So not all of the Crusaders, by a long stretch, actually turn up in Venice for this fleet. And so they don't have the money to pay for this massive fleet. And so the Venetians kind of lock them up on an island and say, you're bloody staying here until you pay for these ships, because we spent ages building them. And so they don't really know what to do. And eventually the Venetians offer them this dodgy deal, which is that they'd had a dispute with the King of Hungary over this town on the coast of the Adriatic. And they'd lost it to the Hungarians, and they wanted it back. And they said, well, so if you could just, like, you know, do a little detour from your trip down to Egypt and get this town back for us. I know it's not really kind of crusading stuff. It's just basically taking a town for us. But, you know, it would help.
I'll give you 10% off.
Yeah, exactly. And the Crusaders are like, oh, okay, we'll do that. Apart from Simon de Montfort, who's this very active and militarily canny French baron, and he's like, yeah, I'm not doing that. That's not crusading. Get lost. And he goes off, and but the others agree to this, and I'm not sure they fully tell the foot soldiers, as it were, what's going on. But anyway, they go off to Hungary to do this. Innocent III is furious because crusades are consecrated holy wars that are only supposed to be used for spiritual purposes, and using them for helping out the Venetian trading position is absolutely not okay. And so he excommunicates them all, and which the leaders of the crusade kind of conceal from the ordinary crusaders. And then in the meantime, the succession crisis, which was caused by the deposition of Andronicus I, has fragmented into another succession crisis in Byzantium. And there's this ex-Byzantine emperor and his son wandering around trying to find backers to put them back on the throne of Constantinople. So the son of this deposed Byzantine emperor turns up and meets the Crusaders and says, look, you've already understood the benefits of a little bit of flexibility as to what you do on a crusade, and you've always wanted the emperor in Constantinople to help you out, and that's always the original plan. And so if you were to put me back on the throne of Constantinople, then I would come out. The vast wealth of Constantinople will be at your disposal. Huge armies of Byzantines. We'd all be together, Latins and Greeks, off to Jerusalem. Waha! And just get me back on the throne. And so they still owe the Venetians a fortune. So the Venetians are like, oh yes, that would be very interesting to gain a kind of controlling interest in Constantinople. And so the leaders of the crusade agree to this blasphemous and sacrilegious misuse of the crusade, and off they go to Constantinople. They, with the help of sort of inside men, because no one ever manages to get into Constantinople unless they have guys on the inside, until finally the Turks do in the 15th century. So they managed to get the Crusaders in. They managed to put this guy back on the throne of Constantinople. It's a disaster. The Greeks can't stand him. They think he's a nasty little Latin toady. What's he doing coming along with these Crusaders? They didn't like him anyway. The treasury turns out to be empty. And he's so loathed by the population of Constantinople that he can't possibly go on crusade with the Crusaders because as soon as he left Constantinople, he'd be deposed. So he totally reneges on the deal. And so the Crusaders are stuck there outside the walls of Constantinople with no money to pay the Venetians and no Byzantine army or Byzantine subsidies to help them go and capture Jerusalem. And so they just sort of lose it. And using the inside knowledge they got through putting him back on the throne, they managed to storm Constantinople together with the Doge of Venice. That's the ruler of Venice, who's actually blind. He jumps off the ship into the water and charges the Byzantines, even though he can't see. It's sort of very. We're supposed to admire this according to the accounts written by the Crusaders, but the fact that you're killing Christians it doesn't seem to. And so the whole thing's a disaster. They sack Constantinople. It's one of the greatest acts of vandalism in Western history. And any remaining good feeling or slight guilt that the Byzantines might have had about the massacre of the Latins under Andronicus I is washed away by the permanent grudge of the appalling sack of Constantinople in 1204. And then they set up this sort of colonial pseudo-Byzantine empire, the Latin Empire of Constantinople, run by the Venetians and these various Western Crusaders. And it's a complete disaster. The first Latin emperor is captured by a bunch of barbarians and is never heard of again. And that it only lasts about slightly less than 60 years before the Byzantines scatter and form these little successor states, which eventually consolidate and recapture Constantinople in the 1260s. But in the course of doing this, they've massively further embittered the feelings, particularly of ordinary Byzantines towards the Latins. So it's a catastrophe. Now, Innocent III, John Paul II apologised for this, which, it's great. It's nice that he apologised. But, I'm not sure that he could really be said to be responsible for it, given that Innocent III excommunicated the Crusaders who did it. So, but anyway. I was very annoyed about it. So the other big problem that they're facing that forms the background to Lateran IV is that this resentment of the laity against the semi-literate, loose-living clergy has been hijacked by this nasty heretical movement, which actually originated inside the Byzantine Empire. It was originally a heresy called of the Paulicians. But by the time it crops up in the West, it's known as the Cathar Heresy, or the Albigensian Heresy, named after Albi, the city in southern France, which is the center of it. And it's really serious. I mean, it's another religion. It's basically the Manichaean religion that Augustine belonged to before he converted to Christianity, and which basically believes there are two gods, a fluffy, glowy, spiritual, white, cotton woolly god, and then an icky, sticky, treacly, bad material god. And although in fact really that both of their ideas are materialistic, but so they think the spirit is this glowy, happy god, and matter is the nasty, treacly god, and the nasty, treacly god attacked the spiritual god, and the two got stuck together. I mean, it really is this stupid, but anyway, and the world is the area of them being stuck together, and the souls of the elect are little fragments of the shiny, happy spiritual god stuck inside the treacly material god, and that's where all evil comes from. All evil comes from matter. Spirit is good, matter is bad, and good people are fragments of spirit encased in matter, and they have a twofold hierarchy: the perfect and the hearers. And the perfect, they are supposed to have nothing to do with matter and eventually starve themselves to death, and then they will be freed and go off and be merged back into the spiritual God. And then there are the hearers, who are the kind of laity, and they basically can do whatever the hell they like, because everything that they do is wrong and bad because it involves the body. Therefore they can, sex, drugs and rock and roll, that's fine because it's all morally indifferent, because it's all evil anyway. It's a bit like Luther's doctrine of total depravity. And then so long as they remember to try and starve themselves to death 20 seconds before they actually do die, then they'll escape into the happy, fluffy God. And but the result is that they're these emaciated figures in long flowing robes who look really kind of impressive and guru-y, like sort of Buddhist figures that Hollywood types like to hang around with. It's exactly the same psychological dynamic. The Hollywood types don't really want to destroy their own personality by dissolving it in nirvana, or only eat fruit, or whatever it is, the guru that they like to hang around with. What they want to do is consume lots of cocaine and sleep with lots of people, but they feel good hanging around with the Buddhist guru guy. And it's the same psychological dynamic with the Cathars, and it sweeps like wildfire, particularly through southern France, because of the fact that they look like the real deal, like these Buddhist gurus do, in the face of the kind of theologically illiterate, morally compromised clergy. Ring any bells? So it's a real danger to the church, and the temporal rulers are either in southern France, particularly, and tragically the Counts of Toulouse, who are the successors of Raymond of Toulouse, who's one of the great heroes of the First Crusade. They are either conniving at it, or they are actually for political reasons, or they actually buy into it, or something. It's not clear what. But eventually the papal legate, who is sent to try and deal with this by Innocent III, gets murdered. And this triggers a crusade against the heretics in southern France, which becomes pretty brutal, called the Albigensian Crusade, which ends up being led by Simon de Montfort, the great crusader who refused to participate in the Fourth Crusade because it being misdirected to profane purposes. So Simon de Montfort. He's a kind of, imagine sort of Cortez and Pizarro with a lot more piety, but just as scary. So he's pretty scary, and he wages this war in the Languedoc in the south of France to extirpate heresy. So all of these different strands kind of climax in the summoning of the Fourth Lateran Council in 1215, and presided over by Innocent III, vast numbers of clerics and bishops there. St. Francis and St. Dominic appear to have been present at the council. they are Innocent the Third sees where things are going, the problem of these disorganized and often heretical lay movements arising out of the frustration of the people, and he's very keen to encourage orthodox versions of these movements. And so he encourages St. Dominic and the foundation of the Dominicans as a response to the heresy of Catharism. And he encourages St. Francis and the foundation of the Franciscans as a response to the general frustration about the lack of genuine apostolic poverty and zeal and simplicity in the clergy. So he's got a great sense for how to disentangle the destructive elements of the social forces of the time and re-harness them to the propagation of the gospel. So he's a very great man, Innocent III. And so yeah, Lateran IV is the single greatest council of the Middle Ages. It begins with a great big creed, which deals with a lot of doctrinal questions. You're often surprised to see that some key question like the attributes of God or how God is noble and stuff, it ends up actually having been dealt with by Lateran IV. So it makes it clear what we mean by the seen and unseen of the Nicene Creed. It talks about, it means the incorporeal angels and the visible creation. It makes it clear that a very important definition and you can see this is coming from the much greater intellectual sophistication of the West now with the rise of the universities. Whatever we assert about God, he is more unlike than he is like. It's a very important principle in the unknowability of God, which we talked about a little bit when we were talking about iconoclasm and Nicaea too. It deals with a heresy promoted inadvertently by this abbot called Joachim of Fiore, he seems to have been a holy guy, but he caused a lot of trouble inadvertently one way or another. He had this error about the Trinity, that the Godhead, the divine substance, was somehow a kind of substratum on which the three divine persons were sort of built, which is definitely wrong in a big way. But it was just because he wasn't that great at the metaphysics. So they actually say, he was a lovely guy and we're not trying to diss him, but he was definitely wrong about this and you're not allowed to hold this. So they deal with that. And
don't listen to a thing he says.
and the other problem that Joachim caused is he had loads of private revelations in which he appeared to see in advance the coming of the Franciscans and the Dominicans. And he became very popular, particularly with the Franciscans and Dominicans, or particularly with the Franciscans. And he was very strong about, the radical poverty of the Franciscans, which is true, but very rapidly, even during the lifetime of St. Francis, there wasn't a lot of actual radical poverty going along with many of the Franciscans. And so the Franciscans had a torrid time, even though they achieved so many wonderful things through the Middle Ages, they also had all these terrible disputes of very bitter Franciscans who wanted to live the genuine ideal of St. Francis and were being prevented from doing so by the luxurious lifestyle of the other Franciscans. And yeah, Franciscan politics in the Middle Ages is it's like trying to understand Somalia or something. But that's not dealt with by the council. The council just deals with the problem about Joachim. Then it has some pretty ferocious stuff backing up the Albigensian Crusade. So they basically say, the crusading armies with full crusading indulgence need to get rid of these heretical regimes from southern France, and not only rulers who are shown to have actually embraced these heresies, but the ones who are just not doing anything about them, after due warning, are to be stripped of their authority, and basically whoever gets rid of them can keep the titles and lands of the heretical rulers. It's a great principle. We might have wanted to apply that to the Reformation, but anyway,
that happens.
So it's pretty brutal. The Albigensian Crusade, yes, it's not for the squeamish, they also have various things what to do about the overlapping rites in the East. because of the fact that the Latins had brought their own clergy with them, and they'd introduced a Latin patriarch in Antioch and Jerusalem and stuff like this. And now, unfortunately, in Constantinople, after this disastrous takeover of Constantinople by the Fourth Crusade, and in fact, it's funny, the Fourth Lateran Council finally allows that Constantinople be the second ranking bishop in the church after all these centuries of resisting that. They finally allow this. Of course, it's the Byzantines are hardly pleased by this, because at this point, A, they always assumed that was the case anyway and just ignored the fact that the popes didn't agree to it, and B, what the Lateran form means by the Patriarch of Constantinople is some Venetian cleric who is now practicing the Roman rite in the Hagia Sophia. So it's hardly, great news, yay for the Byzantines, but it's remained the law of the church to this day. So if you look in the Code of Canons for Eastern churches, the canon on the patriarchates, it says that the Eastern patriarchs, after the Pope, outrank all the other bishops in the entire Catholic Church in the following order: Constantinople, Alexandria, Antioch, Jerusalem. So it's remained the case to this day. And of course, eventually the Byzantines do get Constantinople back. A lot of the secular clergy, there's loads and loads and loads of canons. We can go through them all, but the secular clergy, the term transubstantiation is canonized for the first time.
Oh, really?
By Lateran IV, because throughout the 12th century they've been trying to work out exactly what happens with all the sacraments and what you need to make it work and all that kind of thing. So the technical sense of exactly what's happening is worked out. And again, the apostolic churches, even the ones that aren't in communion with Rome, have agreed to the doctrine of transubstantiation, even though it was only worked out in the 12th century. Although the Byzantine, the Orthodox schismatic Byzantines, sort of a bit grudging about it. They don't really want to admit that we got it right, because they like to disagree with us if they can.
Yeah.
And so there's one school that says we don't believe in transubstantiation. What we believe in is meta-ousiosis, right? Which is just transubstantiation in Greek. But anyway, transubstantiation gets canonized. Famously, the rule that you must go to communion around Easter, at least once a year, and that you must go to confession once a year, is introduced by Lateran IV. And again, this is a way of kind of keeping an eye on who's actually in the church, who's a Catholic in good standing. And right up until the 20th century, in some places, I saw one of these once. A guy I was doing some research on for my PhD years ago. I came across his little card, which proved that he'd been to communion, and he'd been to confession and received communion at Easter or thereabouts that year, to prove he was a Catholic in good standing. And we desperately need to reintroduce this, because this is what allows you to say, "Oi, dodgy politician, go and fix the terrible things you've done, and then you can come back and get your little card. Get out." And so having got rid of that has really, and it's really created this sense, that like everybody's entitled to receive communion, and I privately oppose genocide, but publicly I think it's great. So let's think. They attempt to launch another crusade, which is a long story as to what comes of that, which we haven't got time for. It's a huge. The secular clergy are fed up to the back teeth of all these new religious orders. So this idea of from coming from Charlemagne's time, that basically you've got to be a Benedictine unless you follow the rule of St. Augustine, in which case you're a canon, and that's it, folks. The only variety consists in how rigorously you follow your Benedictine charism, whether or not you focus on religion or focus on poverty. And that was the big rivalry between the Cistercians and the Cluniacs. But over the course of the 12th century, there's loads of different forms of religious life have developed. And of course, in the decade before the Fourth Lateran Council, the Franciscans and Dominicans have emerged. So the secular clergy are think really irritated by these religious orders, because especially the ones that are under papal supervision, because they're immune from the authority of the bishop to a large extent, and it's just seen as vexatious on the part of the secular clergy. So there's big pressure to stop the proliferation of new forms of religious life. And so it's a little bit like what happens at Trent with the Mass. They say, right, that's it, no more. So if you want to found a new religious house, find a rule that's already been written and follow that, okay? No new weird and wonderful religious orders, that's it. So what they mean by that, of course, is they don't actually mean you can't have new abbeys or even new organizations of religious. What they mean is you can't have a new form. You've got to pick one of the existing forms. And so all the ones which, so just like with the different usages of the Roman Rite that happens with Trent and Pius V, that you can, any usage that can be proved to have existed for 200 years continuously is still allowed, but you're not allowed any new, nothing new can emerge. If you've come into existence recently, you have to adopt the rite of Pius V, right? So, which is just a conservative form of the Roman Rite. So they do the same thing with religious orders. Basically, you get this idea from this point onwards that that if you're an really old order, that's fine. You're the Knights Hospitaller, or you follow the rule of St. Columbanus or something. That's great. Knock yourself out. But if you come into existence since 1215, you've got to choose one of the existing ones. And they get this idea. Basically, there's 4 you can pick from: the rule of St. Basil, the rule of St. Benedict, the rule of St. Augustine, and the rule of St. Francis just scrapes in there. And the Dominicans don't have their own rule because they never worked out a rule for themselves. Dominic himself was an Augustinian canon, so having not made it in time with a rule of their own before Lateran IV, they're like, well, we'll just stick with the rule of St. Augustine because that's St. Dominic's rule anyway. So the Dominicans to this day follow the rule of St. Augustine. But all of this is broken down over the centuries since Lateran IV, rather like with the Easter Communion. I always think, going back to whatever Lateran IV did is a sure recipe for reform and restoration in the church. And they've basically allowed in loads of new religious orders since then. Sometimes they give it a slightly technically different canonical name, but it makes no actual difference. Or what their rule is called constitutions instead. Constitutions are supposed to be sort of bylaws that clarify how you follow the rule, but they've been used as a Trojan horse to allow in rules after 1215. So yeah, and a lot of these new religious orders have not been quite the wonderful blessings that they might have been, but we won't go into details. So I think if we'd stuck to the Lateran IV rules, then I think that might have been rather more successful. So there we've reached the kind of high point of the. I'm afraid it's kind of downhill from now on. We've reached the high point of the march of Christian triumph.
Here comes the roller coaster.
Say again, sorry.
Here comes the roller coaster part.
Yes, indeed. So there we are with Innocent III enthroned in glory amidst innumerable multitude of bishops, thundering forth his wise laws and dispatching crusades left, right, and centre, and knocking crowns off the heads of kings until they apologise. I mean, King John of England actually surrendered the Kingdom of England to the Pope. So until the Reformation, it was, even Henry VIII mentioned this. He still believed this until he decided that Anne Boleyn had a rather shapely calf. He actually, as he himself believed, he told Thomas More, to Thomas More's surprise, that 10 years before the Reformation, he said, we receive our crown from the Pope, because John had surrendered his crown to Innocent III in terror at Innocent III's interdict, which he had imposed on England for John's naughtiness. So I mean, yeah, Innocent III was, the Pope on steroids. And Lateran IV was the kind of ecclesiastical climax of the Middle Ages. So we are.
A deep moment of silence.
Yes. Breathe in, inhale.
But appreciate it, man. We'll talk to you for the next one.
Great. God bless. Bye-bye.